Right back to conversation. Congressman Ron Paul is here in the studio with us. He's presidential candidate. The next debate will be when and where, do you figure?
This week. It's in Orlando on Thursday night.
Will this be a Tea Party debate, or will this be a Republican debate, or who's going to do this?
It's a Republican, and I'm sorry, I don't know exactly who the host is, but it's one that I think all the candidates will attend.
It looked to me in the last one that it was a Wolf Blitzer debate, and he was simply manipulating. He was. Let's go beat up on Rick Perry, and he was. It was. I loved the format in South Carolina, where you had a panel of 3 or 4 very highly qualified individuals, asked you guys all the same questions. You did this on an individual basis. They could ask you follow-up questions, probing questions, and it was similar questions for everybody. I learned a lot about the candidates in that debate. I learned nothing out of the spitting contest at this nonsense.
30-second answers.
Oh, it's just stupid. It's just dumb. Do you guys have any influence over that at all, or can you?
No, you'd think we'd be smart enough to get together and say, these are the rules we'll come. Everybody's afraid the other one will go and the other ones might not go. You know, so I'm not going to go. Then you don't know what the other one might do.
Well, why do you?
But we should. I mean, we pander to them, and I think they make some money off us too. They have advertisement. They get a big audience for this.
Well, why do you turn yourself over and your political fates over to people who are your enemies? And who are your I mean, that's just odd.
Did you find it a little bit strange when the Federal Reserve came up? 3 or 4 people got to talk about it with Wolf. And Wolf is a pretty nice guy. I sort of like him. Yeah. But I thought he was setting it up to come back and say, well, this is what these guys say, and this is how they're criticizing. I said, what do you think about the Federal Reserve? But I never got the question.
They served up a softball to the wrong guy. Let's put on your earphones, Congressman Paul,
okay.
and this is going back to what we were talking about with Nixon taking us off the gold standard. And I'm often curious, I was barely remember any of that, but it's useful to go back and listen to his argument why it was necessary.
The third indispensable element in building the new prosperity is closely related to creating new jobs and halting inflation. We must protect the position of the American dollar as a pillar of monetary stability around the world. In the past 7 years, there's been an average of 1 international monetary crisis every year. Now, who gains from these crises? Not the working man, not the investor, not the real producers of wealth. The gainers are the international money speculators. Because they thrive on crises, they help to create them. In recent weeks, the speculators have been waging an all-out war on the American dollar. The strength of a nation's currency is based on the strength of that nation's economy. And the American economy is by far the strongest in the world. Accordingly, I have directed the Secretary of the Treasury to take the action necessary to defend the dollar against the speculators. I have directed Secretary Connally to suspend temporarily the convertibility of the dollar into gold or other reserve assets, except in amounts and conditions determined to be in the interest of monetary stability and in the best interest of the United States.
I will just stop there. Isn't that incredibly textually rich?
Yeah.
Blarney?
It was only temporary, though. So when are we going back on the gold standard? Since to think about it, it was just his announcement, an executive order.
Yes.
And
everybody went along with it.
Nobody said. And what really disturbed me about that, because I remember it clearly, it occurred on a Sunday night. And he also put on high tariffs and wage and price controls.
Yes, he did.
And I thought, this is devastating. This is the worst news I've ever heard in my lifetime at that particular time. And the next day, it was fully endorsed by the stock market and the Chamber of Commerce. Everybody thought, wow, this is wonderful. And I thought, there's something wrong with this country if they think this is good economic news. And it turned out to be horrible economic news. It was, a lost decade. We had high inflation, high unemployment, and a run on the dollar continued. I mean, that speech is classical for misinformation.
So Nixon, Obama is Nixonian.
Absolutely.
He doesn't even know it.
Probably so.
Well, it's interesting. His first premise was you have to halt the get rid of the gold standard in order to control inflation.
exactly the opposite. Stability of the dollar. And
Yes.
just think what has happened
And we
to the
have
dollar.
to halt the speculators in money. You halt speculation on money by what? Stopping the gold shipments to France?
That's-
Well, the speculation wasn't on gold. The speculation was on the currency.
on the dollar, and it's the government that weakened the dollar. We were printing too many of them. But
And he said the strength of our currency is the strength of the economy. Isn't that backwards?
that's absolutely, when you weaken the economy and weaken the currency by printing it, then the dollar goes down.
Well, so the lessons to learn, if there are any, I mean, the very first act of severing the gold window, shutting the gold window for convertibility from the currency to the money, was done for all the wrong reasons, and that whole generation bought it as if it were gospel.
Yeah, and they've been living with it. And at that time, I don't know whether it was that night, but probably that week, Nixon also said, well, we're all Keynesians now. You know, we all accept this idea that government has to run things, and you have to print money, you have to spend money, and this is how you stimulate things. And it's, essentially, we've been running against Keynes since that time. But I think the crisis is built. They can't get away with it any longer. And we have to decide, do we want more authoritarianism and Keynesianism and central economic planning? That's what the Fed is, a central economic planner. And it's being challenged. The market is challenging it, but a large number of people are starting to challenge this. I know the campuses of this country now are starting to challenge, in spite of what they're being taught by their professors. They're challenging the system of economics that we have.
Well, it's interesting that Nixon is right in the following respect. I mean, we're in the middle of the Vietnam War, 1971. That was the height of the Vietnam War. That was after the Tet Offensive, I think.
Yeah.
But we were still heavily engaged in the Vietnam War while he was expanding the welfare net, the safety net, following the Johnson Great Society. So you can't, to raise taxes to fund both of those things would have been political suicide. So he started printing money.
Printing money, and they've been doing it ever since. And it defies all economic laws. Economic laws are even more powerful than central banks and governments, so economic laws rule out in the end. And I think that's what we're facing right now. We cannot live off sustained debt and perpetual debt and spending by the federal government.
And if my reading is correct, and since you're an economic historian, I'm wondering if this is true. But I read that since 1971, when he severed the gold standard from the dollar, that the dollar has reduced in value by 98%.
Not quite. It's 98% since the Fed came into existence from 1913, but it's over 80%. If you start with a new dollar of 1971, I think it's in the 80%. So like today, you can start all over. We have our dollar, and you can talk about it again. But no, the 98 is from the time of 1913. But that's still, that's robbery. That's stealing.
Well, so by Nixon's standard, his policy was an abject failure. If the number one criteria was to control inflation, it did not do that at all.
When the government tells you they're going to do it, or they write a bill and name it, you can be almost certain that they're planning to do exactly the opposite.
Let's talk to as many listeners as we can. I've talked to Dr. Ron Paul's economic strength here. Now, he is almost, in this generation, becoming mainstream because you have all of those candidates now mentioning the Fed. Even Newt Gingrich in the South Carolina debates down there suggested that we ought to monitor the Fed more closely. And that was almost universally ignored in the last election cycle.
Right. It's definitely changed.
Let's talk to Steve. Good morning, Steve.
Good morning, Jim.
Hi. You're talking with Congressman Paul, Steve. Good morning.
Yes, good morning.
Good morning.
Congressman, I've been watching a lot of the debates with a great amount of interest, but one of the things that I don't hear anybody talking about is reducing the cost of government by repealing Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage rules on government contracts. Non-union companies are not in a position to bid on these things. I think we're killing jobs. And the people that I have talked to in our local political circles seem to think that this is the second, third rail of politics to go after Davis-Bacon and prevailing wage rules. What are your thoughts on that?
You're absolutely right. You know, whether it's minimum wages or whether it's wage and price controls when they cap wages, or whether it's Davis-Bacon, The violation there, when you're looking at this from a freedom principle, it is the violation of contracts. In a free society, socially and economically speaking, everything should be voluntary. So if you're in business, dealing with wages should be between the employee and the employer, and they should get no clout. Business should get no clout, and labor should get no clout. So you're on to something. If we got rid of Davis-Bacon, this prevailing wage law, the cost of labor would go down, and we would become more competitive. This is the reason so many of our big corporations left. When the unions have an extra clout, and they bid the price of their labor extraordinarily high. Then now, what about Boeing trying to move to South Carolina? And the federal government comes in and prohibits them. So why wouldn't they want to just leave? If they can't do it here, these companies leave and go overseas. So we're doing a lot to hurt ourselves.
What can we do to get this discussion into these debates and get it to the political front here? Because a lot of the things they're talking about a lot of the cuts they're talking about could be subsidized by getting rid of Davis-Bacon and prevailing wages.
Well, although you understand it, I'm not sure the people who ask us these questions have the vaguest idea what you're talking about, and they don't want to get into it, or they want to be sympathetic to labor, and it's too confusing for a 60. See, we've taken 3 or 4 minutes now. So it would be tough to give the 60 or the 30-second answer to this, and then they would turn it and twist and say, "Oh, you hate working people."
Exactly.
That would be the summary of it all
the time.
So it has to be done elsewhere. It's not going to be in the debates. It has to be done unless it's a good conversation, unless we had more Jan Michelson around that we could talk about this stuff. But it's educational. That's why young people in college studying now, they've come across Austrian economics, and they understand this, but it's just we're in transition now, so we have a long way to go.
We'll continue right after our farm markets with Congressman Ron Paul, and we'll go right to our phone lines at 284-1040 or 800-469-4295 in a moment.
Good morning. I'm